Hi, welcome back to another episode of Real-World Serverless. Today we're joined by Alex Bouchard. Hey man, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, man.
So Alex, you are the CEO and the co-founder of Hookdeck, a serverless event gateway service. And I guess we have we did some partnership a little while back on some sponsorships for my newsletter, and had a look at your service. It looks quite interesting, and I think from our email conversation earlier, you have also built Hookdeck on top of serverless technologies as well, using Cloudflare workers and things like that. So I'm really quite interested in hearing about how you guys have built the Hookdeck under the hood and how you found Cloudflare workers. Because me and I think a lot of the other people that are listening to this podcast are more coming from the AWS side of things. So really interested to hear how Hookdeck, say, differentiates from, say, something like AWS EventBridge or SNS or what have you. Before we get into it, yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself and Hookdeck.
Yeah, I mean, totally. We first decided to sponsor your podcast a couple of months ago, I want to say, mainly because of your AWS audience. Like we were seeing more and more kind of heavy AWS users, EventBridge, Lambda, and those sorts of folks kind of migrating over to Hookdeck. And so it kind of made sense for us to try to like sponsor in that space. But I'm also happy to bring different perspective on, what service looks like with Hookdeck, with Cloudflare, with other services that we use. So it might be like a bit of a branching out, but hopefully that's a constructive one. A bit about me. I kind of started early as like a product designer. I worked on all sorts of product from B2C to B2B. Eventually ended up in e-commerce. We grew this like fairly big subscription business in Montreal. And as part of that, we built a ton of the original kind of stack to power that because Shopify really wasn't what it is today. And behind that, there's just like so many webhooks, like webhooks from Stripe and Shopify and Intercom and all those platforms. And, webhooks for some businesses, and I think it's more and more the case, are kind of like those critical like integration events that you require to be able to operate your business. And it was just so difficult to be successful with them. And so that's where kind of a deck was burned out. And so I'm kind of like this mix of designer and product engineer, technologist, like whatever you want to call it. I find that's actually a pretty great mix to be building and kind of like dev tools, dev infrastructure space. So yeah, it's been great.
Yeah, because in this particular space, there's actually quite a lot of, I guess, business opportunities. Because you've seen companies like a Segment and a few others who are also in this kind of space where essentially taking over, ingesting events from third-party vendors and Shopify and other e-commerce platforms, so that make it easier for you to just the right application code that's relevant for your business, as opposed to the kind of the plumbing. And that's kind of the serverless promise, right? That you get to focus on the business problems as opposed to the underlying infrastructure. Um, so I guess in that case, are you in a similar space as something like a Segment, where you kind of sit in the middle between your application and, say, third-party events? But do you also kind of overlap with EventBridge? Because you mentioned people are moving to Hookdeck from EventBridge, where it's not just about just in the third-party events, but also your own business events between different services in, say, like a microservices environment.
Yeah, totally. So ultimately, I think like we compare ourselves to EventBridge a lot more. We've coined this term that we're still kind of trying to get people to get rally behind this concept of event gateway, and really, it's kind of like inspired by what API gateways has been to bridge kind of the outside world with your own endpoint business logic and that sort of stuff, but specifically for asynchronous event driven applications, right? And we think of EventBridge as an event gateway. I mean, it's not that far of a stretch, right? EventBridge, event gateway, it's like more or less synonyms. But really, we're kind of just trying to say event gateways are this new category, the way of thinking about your integration events, but are coming from outside your system, right? So integrations in terms of like Shopify or Stripe or Twilio or GitHub, you name it. And even in some cases, like we're looking at SDKs, libraries, IoT devices, scanners, like all those sorts of things, right? Like events are coming from outside your network topology, they're coming from outside your cloud, and so on. And then bridging that with your business logic. Because I think in many cases when you're looking at Segment, or even like I'm going to go a bit further, like even Zapier and that sort of stuff, like those were tools that were built for uh, like business analytics or business operation type people, right? It wasn't built for engineers. And so like the proxy is interesting and there's definitely a lot in common, but I think like the main difference is that this is built for engineering teams and DevOps teams that need to operate services scale and run thousands of function invocations a second and so on, right? And so much closer to EventBridge. One of the big distinction that I draw specifically to our approach with compared to EventBridge is that Hookdeck itself is a queue, so it operates as a HTTP push queue instead of a pull queue, which is surprisingly fairly unique. Like you do see others doing that, like GCP PubSub, for instance, has a push mode. Um, but the app opens out a ton of flexibility when it comes to serverless because you don't need workers to be pulling off those queues, right? And so there's a ton of opportunity in terms of where you can run your business logic. So it doesn't have to be AWS. It can be any cloud. It can be any runtime, but still bring the benefit of serverless to it. Or at least some of the serverless benefit to it. And so that's really how we're thinking about Hookdeck. It's this bridge, this connector between your integration events from all the services and devices and so on to your core business logic.
Okay. Is there anything that you can kind of show us, give us a quick demo of what that looks like? Because I have to admit, I haven't quite seen it myself. I've gone through your website and look at a few, some of the information that you have on there, as well as some videos that you publish, but not quite seen the product in action myself. So I'm quite interested to hear and learn a little bit more about it as myself as well.
Yeah, I know, totally. Let's dive in. I recognize demos might be a bit more difficult for kind of like audio only listeners, and so I'm going to invite you to follow through the YouTube link that's going to be in the
In the
podcast
show notes,
notes.
yes, it will be.
Yeah, the show notes. Thanks. And then I'll kind of like try to do my best to give like more context than I would on just a normal share screen, just so that people listening by audio can follow along. Um, so let me get that going. All right, we're on. Um, so I guess like the first place I want to start is Hookdeck responsibility, kind of like your life cycle starts much sooner than it would with, say, EventBridge. The reason why I say that is like we're really trying to focus on the full software development lifecycle. And so really where your kind of experience with Hookdeck starts is in development. So in this specific context, I have a Shopify kind of like demo. I'm just going to be using
So
Shopify as an
when you
example here,
say
but
like the full development life cycle and starting with development, are you talking
yeah.
more specifically about local development experience?
Yes, thank you for clarifying. I'm talking about local development experience. Like one of the common problem when it comes from of events that are coming from outside your own system is that those are generated by external system, right? And therefore don't have a way of reaching, let's say, like your local environment. There's tools that have been built in the past that kind of like do this tunneling, but all those tunnel services are built on synchronous assumptions, and so that means you have a single tunnel that's open toward your computer or your VM or whatever. And then there's only a single connection possible at any given point in time because of this kind of like one-to-one relationship. Hookdeck is fundamentally asynchronous. And so what that allows us to do is to kind of like break this assumption and let you have multiple kind of quote unquote tunnels connected at the same time for the same URL. And that's very, very good when you're working in teams, right? Like one thing that you will see often is like in software and development teams that are integrating with, Shopify or whatever, is that they're going to have to either have a ton of different URLs or they're going to sync up between each other where it's like, oh, this developer is using this one and I'm using this one and I can't connect to this and so on, right? And so, yes, we start from local development, but when I talk about SDLC, it's the local development process, it's the testing, it's the integration tests, the deployment and production operation.
Okay. Yeah, those are really common problems that people run into, certainly on the EventBridge side of things. And I've kind of developed some practices to kind of, make local development a bit easier, but it's never going to be quite, the same as say, if you want to try check your EventBridge rules set up correctly, that you're catching the events and getting them directed to your Lambda function correctly. There's always some
Yeah.
things you can't quite catch easily without deploying to AWS and just trying it out. And so I'm really quite curious how you guys are doing that here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm gonna get into it, but it's gonna be a recurring theme, I think here.
Okay.
And the reason why I'm saying that is because really like we just paid a ton more attention to like the end-to-end developer experience, right? And so there's a lot of things that are doable in either systems, but then it's also like a boil down of like how easy is it to set up, how accessible is it, what's the developer experience and that sort of stuff, right? And I think in many ways, like we've paid a lot of attention to that. So I expect that's the type of comment I'm gonna get a couple of times through this demo.
Okay, good.
But yeah, let's have a look. I just kind of like put something simple here. So receiving in this case webhooks from Shopify, so events from Shopify. I'm subscribed to two types of events: the order created, and then the product updated. And then that's targeted to go to two of my local services. So on my local computer, I currently have a product service running and a order service running. And I've set up filters on each one of those, what we call connections, to be able to tell which events I want to go to which service, right? So in this case, for instance, on the out of stock case, I have a filter on the body property where the variant inventory quantity is lesser or equal to 0, right? And then on the case of the orders, I have a filter on the header property where the X Shopify topic starts with orders, right? And so in this case, I'm kind of telling Hookdeck what is the routing logic in between all the events that are coming into my system and the services that I need to get to. Now the next step to that is I need to actually connect to this. And so on my terminal, I'll
Sorry,
do
can we go back to the previous screen just quickly? Because in that
absolutely
previous screen here, I'm looking at the Shopify being the event source. I'm guessing you are turning those are webhook events, and then that's why
correct. Yeah.
you've got the filters on the header,
Yeah.
and then you're able to, so those that syntax you got there earlier, the less than or equal to. I guess that is a unique syntax that you guys offer. That's specific to Hookdeck.
Yeah, that's correct. We have our own filtering syntax that's
Okay,
really meant to
right.
be super straightforward. And really, instead of being a JSON schema match evaluator, it's a value evaluator. And there's actually no great standard around that. So we built our own kind
Okay,
of like syntax, which is open source, by the way.
okay. And I like the fact that you can show the last event that's been captured side by side
Oh, yeah,
in
yeah,
your
absolutely.
editor.
And you can test your filters and all that sort of stuff, right?
Okay,
Yeah.
that's cool.
Um, okay, all right. So to keep, by the way, I love that you're kind of jumping in. That this is how this is the right way to make a demo in my mind. Just like rambling on for half an hour is not that interesting to me. So we offer the Hookdeck CLI. The CLI can be started from your terminal. So in this case, I'm already kind of logged in my account and all that. But you can use it without an account. So we support like kind of what we call guest mode. And so you don't actually need to give us any information about you to be able to use this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run Hookdeck listen 9001. 9001 is the current port that the services are running on. They're kind of running inside the same service for now, but they could be on different port. And then if I start this command, it's going to ask me which source I want to be listening to. So I could have, my Shopify, my GitHub, my Twilio, and I can selectively decide: do I only want to listen to a specific subset of those? Do I want to listen to all of them? So in this case, I'm going to go with Shopify. And then what it's going to tell me is like, okay, great. You're now listening on those two connections, right? So what we'll do next is we'll add in Shopify. Which one was it? Okay, right here. So I kind of prepared a order in Shopify. I'm kind of going to be buying this Real-World Serverless mug and place the order. And so as I place the order, this is now going to generate a webhook. And any second now, we can see boat request kind of came in on my localhost, right? And so we can see there was a 200 HTTP post request that was made to localhost 9001 and then to both of my services. So in this case, there's /order /webhook /orders and then /webhook /product. And so that's really kind of like the bare bones, just like showing that amount of flexibility that you have for localhost development. But we also give you like the full visibility around that. And so you can see all the events that are associated with yourself or any other of your team members. And there's the kind of like full history of those events. You can inspect what the request data is, so the headers, the body, and then also the response for that data. And you can, obviously retry it. And so if I were to send this back again to my service, I'm developing, I made some kind of mistake, I'm sending it back, and now we can see there's kind of like a third request that's coming in, right? Without like going into too much details, there's a lot more you can do around development. We have this concept of bookmarks where you can create kind of like postman-like collections of all the events that you're expected to receive. You can do integration tests and just like development tests against those bookmarks. But I'm going to spare you some of the details, or else we're going to be here for a while.
Sure. So in that case, earlier in that first screen, I saw you have two subscriptions already to a local service, and then when you start and then go to CLI, you start in another one to say you want to listen to those events. So are those two different things? The ones that I saw in the console and the one that you started in the CLI?
No, those are the same. And so really it's kind of like the relationship of like you can see both the status of it on your console or like in the dashboard itself. And so, yeah, those are the same.
So how come? So in that case, how come those local services was really on the Hookdeck dashboard before you started listening in the CLI?
Oh, sorry, I kind of prepped that ahead of time for the demo.
Right.
Yeah. So, but we could go together and add another one. Like if we were to add another one,
so
then
you just
we
need
would
to add the connections before you can start listening. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So if you're familiar to AWS EventBridge or other services, like the way to think about it really is that the source, what we call a source, in this case Shopify, is kind of equivalent to a topic when it comes to most queuing system, right? And then the connection itself is the subscription. And then lastly, the destination is the consumer. So in this case, if we're looking at the screen, your topic is Shopify events. We have 2 subscription out of stock, all orders, and those are going to 2 destinations or consumers, and those consumers are the product service and the order service.
Okay. And in this case, do you have to write anything? How do you write the consumer? I guess the consumer code, is it I guess is it, and also what do the events come in look like? Does it follow some kind of like an envelope that you've got so that the events are wrapped with some metadata and stuff like that?
So ultimately, like a deck acts as a HTTP proxy, and so that means the data that we get is just using like the HTTP definition of those events, right? So like the headers, the body, and so on. And we don't wrap it inside an explicit envelope, and that's mainly for compatibility, kind of across the board. But we're going to get into this a little bit later. But we have the concept of transformations. And what some folks do is that they'll format that data into envelope using transformations. And so with those transformations, you can basically run post-processing function on all the data that comes in. And so Shopify obviously is not going to send it in like a specific envelope, but you can wrap that into your own envelope. And what people will also do is that, for instance, if you get from Shopify, from WooCommerce, from BigCommerce, or Commerce Layer, and so on, you might also have like standardized envelope around like what an order definition is, right? And so you can have different transformation for the different order shape that are coming in and format it into like a common format, for instance.
Yeah, because one of the things that people in the DDD space that talks about a lot is the idea of an anti-corruption layer, where you don't want your business domain to be tightly coupled to the contract of, say, Shopify webhook. You want you want to have some layer in there so that if they were to change something in the webhook payload, you don't have to rewrite all of your business logic because now some field had to change. You want to centralize and basically make that change in just a layer at the ingestion point, so that in your event handler you would transform that into a payload that your application understands. I guess going to that point, obviously EventBridge doesn't speak HTTP. And all the payloads and stuff comes in its own envelope. Is very much geared towards those exchange of events within your services. You are speaking more just HTTP as, I guess, as a language that you're talking about in terms of the events. Everything it looks like HTTP requests, got payload, got headers, and so on. In that case, how would you use it for, say, like within your, because you said it's built for developers, it's built for people that are building their own services. Obviously, between my services, I don't really want to speak HTTP. Not speaking like talking to another HTTP API, and I wanted to just say I want to send an event, and order has been placed or something like that. How do I translate that? Do I need to translate that at all, or does it matter? Does it not matter what I sent to Hookdeck?
Yeah, because there's not like a structured envelope, it doesn't really matter, right? And so in the
Okay,
sense, like the envelope is like self user defined, and so if you want to have
right.
an envelope, then you can do it. But it's not like something that's strictly enforced. What we see most often is that, well, first of all, like webhooks are commonly used, and even if like specifically in the case of Shopify, if you receive them through EventBridge, like that's all well and good. But the problem is that you're probably also receiving with big commerce or WooCommerce or whatever, and those don't have direct to EventBridge kind of like enveloped support, right? And so that means you're going to have to go through API gateway. You're going to have to format it into your own envelope and all that sort of stuff. And so like what we see is that most people already have HTTP endpoint handler. And so the huge benefit of that is that you don't actually have to change anything about how your system work or any of the assumptions that it make. Because if you have a endpoint that's going to be receiving webhooks already, possibly like queuing it to SQS or like putting it into EventBridge, uploading that data to S3, that sort of stuff. Um, that endpoint already exists and already has like knowledge of the business logic that it needs to run. And so really like the way that we think about Hookdeck is that it can come in and insert itself in between, bringing you that benefit of like a EventBridge like platform, but without having to like completely restructure your architecture around the fact that now you're receiving events that have like specific envelope and specific protocols and all that sort of stuff, right? And so like the beauty of HTTP in this case is that it's very transparent to like the current operations that you're already doing. And it's very rare that you're going to see a team that like from the get-go, the very first implemented version they do is with EventBridge and all the complexity that comes with it. It tends to be like, oh, I'm going to spin up a Lambda with HTTP that's exposed to HTTP with API gateway. And for the first like couple thousand webhooks we receive, that's probably going to be fine. And at some point you get some success that you're like, oh crap, like I need to rethink this, right? And so that's what we tend to see a lot more. And that's also like the adoption path that I think we're trying to like very much like simplify.
Okay. I mean, I guess the difference there is that you're looking at this very much with e-commerce lens, because obviously in that space, Shopify and I guess many of the other vendors in that space are going to be using webhooks to talk to your systems. I guess from where I'm sort of coming from, where there's kind of a lot of the enterprise environments I'm working in, there's zero
Mm-hmm.
webhook. There's literally no webhook. It's all system to system within your I don't know, a bank or what have you, and everything. And so that's where for me, be looking at this, looking at your events, and the events looking like HTTP messages feels odd in that regard. Whereas from where I'm coming from, probably much more the sort of maybe even closer to the SOA world, in terms of event messages and envelopes and some of the more enterprise integration kind of patterns you saw before, but less this kind of the webhook centric, I guess, kind of view. I guess that's where for me it looks kind of weird that okay, these are just HTTP messages in JSON. I know you guys don't enforce any you don't enforce this particular format, so I can just come up with my own messaging. But just at first glance, it's kind of weird that everything kind of speaks HTTP, even though it's all building event driven stuff. That's where I guess the disconnect is coming from for me.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's totally reasonable. I think that comes back to the type of environment that you're building in, right? Because for a lot of software development teams nowadays, webhooks are all the rage because really building software is integrating software for a big subset of people. And so whether or not that's built on Twilio or Salesforce is another really big one, right? What you tend, or at least what we tend to see, is that there's a lot of adoption around those integrations and third parties and offloading a lot of the system complexity that you're building. And then as part of that, the need to integrate with them and integrate with their events becomes really important, right? Another system, for instance, that is hugely popular on the deck is Stripe and all payment platforms, right? So Paddle, Checkout.com, like all those sorts of providers. And so really, I think more and more, especially in kind of like this companies and startups that have been built in, let's call it like last 5-10 years and so on, there's a strong bias toward buying systems or using third-party systems instead of building your own. And then really what you're adding on to that is what's unique for your business, right? What's unique for your business logic or for the product or the service that you do. And when you look at those type of companies, webhooks are everywhere. and so the assumptions around HTTP that comes from webhook is something that's very widely spread, and it's kind of hard to find a platform now that doesn't support some form of outbound HTTP webhook. And so really, this bridge is meant to speak that language and be as simple as possible for those sorts of use cases where really those events are not events that you generated yourself, right? They're not domain generated events. They're not events that you're responsible for. They're events that you're, my computer's going to sleep. They're events that you're almost victim of, right? In some context, right? Because we've added like a ton of cases where, for instance, like Shopify will, send 1 million, 2 million events to you over a very short time span, and people being unable to process those and all that sort of stuff, right? And so really, the thing that's very interesting about this kind of particularity is that ultimately, this is a messaging system where you have no control over the producer, right? The producer is going to send whatever it wants to you in whatever shape it wants at whatever speed it wants. And so that's part of kind of like the challenge that we're trying to tackle as well, right?
Sure, but I think that's the same with EventBridge as well. Just that also EventBridge has got its own third-party event they support. They basically do the ingestion of the webhooks for you, and then they convert them to, a format that's not that doesn't look like HTTP. Whereas you guys kind of do the opposite.
Yeah.
And I guess one thing I also want to find out about as well in terms of building asynchronous processes. One of the key things is about handling errors and retry because everything is failing behind the scenes asynchronously. So in terms of detection, in terms of built-in retries, what do you do? Do you do something similar to, I guess, EventBridge in the sense that you get some built-in retries and exponential backoff and stuff like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me maybe like skip to kind of like what I'd prepare from a production stand of view, and I'm going to get into like kind of all those details because right here I actually have like two environments set up. Where I have my development environment and my production environment. And in the production environment, those same services that we were looking at earlier, right? Like so, the product service and the order service. In this case is instead targeting Lambda function, right? And so earlier we're looking at localhost, kind of like through HTTP server locally, but in this context we're targeting those Lambda functions.
That's sharing the screen, by the way. You said, were you
really?
mentioning?
Okay. Sorry, I think my computer went to sleep and then the screen share died in the process.
Stopped, okay.
So coming back to it. Okay, so now we're kind of like in a similar screen as earlier, but I'm in the production project instead of the development one.
Okay, right.
And those services here we can see are targeting Lambda URLs instead of specific like localhost and so on that we were looking at earlier.
So in this case, you're expecting your Lambda functions to use a function URL so that you've got okay, right. Because you
correct. Although we're building direct trigger for we're building support for directly triggering Lambda functions, and that's going to be coming up in about a month now. We're also building kind of like built-in support for S3, SQS, and a bunch of other services like that, and not just in the AWS environment, right? Like same is true for other cloud providers. But yes, like for all purposes, same services, this time targeting those Lambda URLs. And then if we have a quick look at my Lambda function here, so just kind of like for the purpose of the demo here, I have like this function that returns a HTTP 500 status code, right? And And so to get to your point about errors, if we look at my events here, so earlier when we did this order together in Shopify, we actually generated events on both a production and development environment because I had Shopify target both sources. And then what we can see is I have like some HTTP 500 errors. And then I also have a next attempt at. And so really what the system is telling me is that there's going to be a retry that's going to be happening at a specific like scheduled time. And that's based on the retry logics that you can configure in Hookdeck. So we support exponential backoff, linear backoff. We also support like custom retry schedules that you can define through the retry after HTTP header from the responsive media server. And so really you have like kind of full control over when retries happen and the scheduling around those retries. And that's for everything that's automated. But you can also do this in kind of like manually. So for instance, I could filter on all my failed events, in which case I have like 5 of them. And then I can either manually retry them, but I could also bulk retry based on conditions, right? And so I could say retry all events that match specific conditions. And I can go beyond that, right? I could say that have like specific data in the body. Like, so for instance, like maybe a customer ID, right? Sorry. Ugh. Yeah, so it could be like a customer ID, for instance, where it's 1, 2, 3 or whatever, and then customer ID. And then I actually check what the customer ID was. So this is not going to work right now. But the point is like you can have like those kind of like complex conditions and do bulk retries towards that, right? So instead of like kind of building a arbitrary archive of everything that exists, the idea is that the archive is kind of like persistent really. And at any given point in time, you can filter it, segment it, kind of slice and dice it the way that it makes sense. And then you can retry those like specific segment of events that you define, right? And so that gives you a lot of flexibility around this. Actually, there's nothing with customer ID in 1, 2, 3, so this is not going to work. But so that's very much kind of like one part of the story. But I think the other part of the story is the observability. So if you have a look here at issues, we have this concept of issues, which really for us is a way of kind of replacing dead letter queues. And so issues will group together events that fail for similar conditions, right? So in this case, you can see we have HTTP 500 on out of stock and then on all orders. And if I were to drill through on one of those, I can see like a timeline of when those errors happened. What is the response from my server? In this case, it's just returning hello world. What is the data, like sample data that's associated with those failure conditions? And then as I'm resolving the problem, maybe like a service went down, I brought it back up, and so on. I can then like submit a bulk retry associated with that issue, right? So we can see like, okay, I want to retry all events between those states for HTTP 500 on this connection and blah, 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 blah. And so you can, instead of having kind of like dead letter queues where everything that fails ends up kind of like bunched up together, where you can't really tell apart what's what, we give you like very specific breakdown and drill through abilities on like the specific things that failed and also a resolution step for that. So that's something I'm really, I think, proud of, because as someone that works with queues all the time, dead letter queues are basically the bane of my existence. and so that's our approach to it.
Yeah, like dealing with the data queues is always, and also the whole process of investigating them and then replaying them is quite a process. It's not very nice. And what you've shown me just now, being able to see all the individual failures and be able to replay from there, but also be able to see them already categorized and I guess grouped together by error type, and then be able to reprocess them as a batch. This is super nice from the operational point of view.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we have like a ton of different issue types for different type of failure conditions, but we have like triggers for, I guess, perhaps like one of the most interesting ones is for back pressure as well. And so if you accumulate some amount of back pressure on your processing, we'll alert you about them, and then also like give you like the specific metrics around like what's causing back pressure. So is it your response time? What's your concurrency? And then give you resolution step as in like increase your concurrency and that sort of stuff, right? And so issues have been like a super powerful system, and it's definitely making like the operational process of managing kind of all those inbound events like so much simpler.
You mentioned the observability, and I see there's some metrics there. So I guess that's one of the things that you can see in terms of just how many messages are received, sent, failed, and maybe break down by path, perhaps.
Yeah, actually, let's have a look here at all my delivery attempts. And so you can see here, those are the
Right.
all the events that I got on my specific consumers or destinations, right? Delivery rate, there's nothing pending at this moment. Response latency, so the time that it took, really, so it looks like we're looking at about 400, 300 milliseconds right now.
What is that
Obviously, this
response
is like
latency? Is that end to end in terms of the time between you receiving the event and when you call the destination, or when the destination
so
has
we do have
responded?
metrics about end to end. This one specifically is like the Lambda response time.
Okay.
And so that would measure the time that it's leaving a deck server until the time that we got a response from the Lambda function.
Right. Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, and this is relevant because you can configure delivery rate basically based on parallel, so per second or concurrent. And so, for instance, if you have a 5 per second concurrency
Right.
on your destination consumption, then obviously like the speed at which you deliver those is now impacted by the response latency of your server. Um, and so being able to do this relationship of like, oh yeah, okay, I'm accruing back pressure because my server is now slower and therefore not consuming as fast. Um, is pretty clear to look at kind of like through those metrics, right?
Right. Yeah, this is also quite nice because probably I guess asked about 50% of the time how to maximize concurrency and throughput. The other 50% is how do I restrict my concurrency for my Lambda, because Lambda is super scalable, but my downstream system is not. It's running some legacy database,
Yeah.
DB2 or whatever. You can't handle 10 requests a second, and so we have to make sure the Lambda function doesn't run so frequently that it causes problem downstream. And so normally you use things like the Lambda concurrent reserve concurrency or something like that. But here
Yeah.
you can actually control the delivery rate at the source so that you can say, we don't want more than, say, I don't know, 5 concurrent requests or 5 requests per second, which are slightly different depending on how how things go. So this, yeah, I like this. This is quite useful.
Yeah, no, and I think this is something that's interesting with the kind of like standard model right now is that it's a destination or the consumer responsibility to
Right.
control its concurrency. But there's kind of like two core problems that make that difficult. The first one is that if you're scaling your number of consumers, then inevitably you're also scaling your concurrency, and your aggregated concurrency across all your consumers is very difficult to control. In the case of Lambda, AWS like specifically give you the provision like concurrency concept, but really what it's just doing, it's telling AWS like, hey, okay, here's the amount of Lambda you want to execute in parallel. But if you're using like something like Fargate or running, Kubernetes containers or what have you, your aggregate concurrency is very difficult because now you need to be able to like scale the number of workers, but for each new worker that you add, you're also increasing like the concurrency, right? And so we're flipping it a little bit. And the other thing that's nice is that regardless of what's the underlying method that's used to run the service, so right now, like a lot of the conversation we've had has been like Lambda specific, but really the reality is that we're seeing all sorts of runtime sitting as kind of like Hookdeck destinations, right? And by having a single model for this is how you control concurrency, instead of each of the individual runtime having their own different ways of controlling concurrency, really simplifies kind of like the mental model for it, right? Because if you're using Hookdeck, it's like regardless of what's processing it, I can control my concurrency in Hookdeck itself, and it's the same way of controlling it regardless of the runtime.
Yeah, yeah, and also with Lambda, they got two different things that they have the reserve concurrency, which I think is what you were actually talking about when you said the provision
Right? Yeah,
concurrency, because
I
they
misspoke.
also have provision concurrency, which is a different thing. It's,
Right.
it's kind of confusing, and and
Provision
the
concurrency
two
is
of
more on the pricing side of things, really, right?
it's about it's about keeping certain instances of your Lambda function warm, so you don't see
Oh,
cold
for the
starts.
cold start, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
it's more for the cold start than for limiting concurrency, and reserve concurrency really is the maximum concurrency. But they
Right.
can't call it reserve because you're reserving some unit of your maximum
Mm-hmm.
region-wide concurrency for this one function. So it's like this again, like this that confusion. It's another
Right,
reason
right,
why,
right.
and what not just Lambda, plus there's also, like you said, EC2, there's Fargate, ECS, what have you, all with different mechanisms for controlling concurrency. So
Yeah.
instead of dealing with all of that, and plus, as you start to add more and more integration targets, different targets going to have its own model for managing concurrency. So it's just much easier to have one model for managing concurrency and delivery rate.
Yeah, absolutely. And like when we're looking at a demo and stuff, like obviously it's like a simplified version of the problem. But the reality is like when we look at a lot of our customers, they're going to have 20, 50 like different destinations or consumers. And those are not necessarily going to be all running on the same underlying like runtime or hardware or anything like that, right? And so it's easy to say like, oh, here's how you solve the problem with Lambda. It's like, okay, all well and good. But now as an engineer working that specific company, I now have to like figure out how to solve that problem in like 5 different places instead of a single place, right? And it's very rare that you see it where it's like all neat and pretty. Like people have accumulated technical debt, there's services that were built years ago and all that sort of stuff, right? And so I think that like greatly simplifies things. I actually, so in our kind of like production project here, I also added like another S3 destination just because I wanted to like
Right.
share, for instance, what that might look like if you're actually, it's not a one-to-one relationship of, oh, you get your event, it goes to like some consumer and it's very simple. So in this case, I'm actually setting it to a S3 bucket as my destination. And the way that Hookdeck will work is that it will kind of like fan those events out, right? It's going to basically create copies of them. So as it comes in from Shopify, we're going to get we're going to get all data sent to S3. But then for those that are also out of stock or are orders, we're then going to get a copy of those going to those specific connections. And so in the S3 one, I have a transformation here, which is what I was referring to earlier about. And that transformation is going to basically remove some PII. So I'm like trimming user emails and so on from the body. And then I'm setting a file name for S3. So I'm kind of using the Shopify webhook ID in this case as the file name. And what that does now is that for every event that we get, if we head over to S3 bucket, now I'm getting a JSON file, right? That I can keep, for instance, for like my archive or potentially trigger other events in the AWS ecosystem after that from there, right?
Right.
And right now, all of this is very AWS centric, but again, often people will then like send it to Segment and Datadog and blah, 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 right? You name it.
Right.
So it's rarely just kind of like cookie cutter, everything going to one place.
Okay. So question about that transformation is
Mm-hmm.
that so I guess you are hosting that code, so you are running that transformation code. So I guess it is just JavaScript, or it is some subset of JavaScript that you can use because I imagine it's running some secure environment that you don't want
Yeah.
people to start hacking while running stuff on your machine, doing stuff that they're not supposed to.
Yeah, totally. So those are running in what we call like isolated VMs that we spawn for each one of the transformation function, and they're fully isolated execution context from one another. One thing that's interesting about transformations right now, they're just JavaScript, but we're actually looking at like WebAssembly based solutions to support multiple languages. But those functions are pure functions, and so what that means is that you can't really do I/O. And so there's no like you can do HTTP requests or read files or like that sort of stuff. They're really kind of like that's why they're called transformations, really. But the flip side of them is that they're highly efficient. They're meant to not basically be able to fail, although there's still some logic around error handling. But the core idea for those is basically they're lightweight, they're free. We do not charge for those executions, right? And it lets you format that like data, that HTTP data that you weren't so much of a fan of earlier, into like those envelope or that format or standardize and perform any sorts of logic on that data. And so we have like, for instance, people they'll get webhooks from Wix, for instance, which are JWT encoded, and then they'll use transformation to decode the JWT into raw JSON, right?
Right.
Or the data might come in as gzip, and you need to unzip it, like decompress it, and like there's a ton of different use cases, and really like the breadth and depth of what people need to do with them is basically why we kind of decided to go the route of let's just let user run arbitrary code to be able to like format the data into what they need.
Okay, sure, that makes sense. And I saw this. It's like no output yet. Does that mean that you can actually run this transformation function testing in the console here?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we were to like, for instance, like console.log, we, and then run this, like we're basically going to get log output. We can see like the diff in between the data that we got and
Okay,
then the data that
nice.
we wrote. So in this case, like the path got overridden and things like that. Yeah.
Right. Okay, cool. That's really this is actually very nice. There's some like you got some really nice touches that are okay, things that are small, but like okay, I wish like EventBridge has got some of these things which would make life so much easier.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's really interesting, kind of like coming back to your comment around the HTTP envelope. And I think that for some people, like the way that we're building it is such a no brainer because they actually don't have that much exposure to EventBridge and kind of like more classic like event driven architecture development inside like big enterprise with like big internal systems and that sort of stuff, right? And like really the way that they think about events, or I've been like calling webhooks the gateway drug to event driven architecture for some years. I think for a lot of developers are building, for instance, like a Shopify app, and they hit their stride and it becomes like super popular. It's their first exposure to like, okay, how am I going to deal with 500 1,000 events per second coming from Shopify? um, and and from folks coming from this kind of background, like the HTTP envelope makes a ton of sense because that's already how they're thinking about it, right? Um, but it's interesting to hear your perspective about that, and I think ultimately it's probably one of the bigger distinction beyond kind of like the developer experience and all of it. And I'm interested to see like how over time we can like bridge that gap and how we can maybe like support like both kind of mental models.
Yeah, I think you already support both because you're not forcing the HTTP. I guess the syntax is just you're just reflecting them as they come in, and
Right.
you don't you don't force anything, so I can still use the kind of format that I'm used to in terms of sending, like I said, more traditional event-driven architecture style messages as opposed to more so webhook style HTTP messages. So I think you can really support that. It just and also, I think that difference is probably more cosmetic in the grand scheme of things. Is
Right.
the thing that jumps out at first, but probably not the most important thing. I think things like what you showed me earlier in terms of handling the failures and replaying them, those have far more operational value than anything else. What about in terms of other things that say EventBridge often offers things like schema discovery, stuff like that?
Yeah. Are you familiar with Dave Boyne event
Yep,
catalog?
yep.
Um, so actually, I think that makes a ton of sense to say that like other services are going to do this like very well. And so Phil from a team recently built a exporter for Hookdeck to event catalog, and I think that's the type of way that we think about it. Really, is there's going to be product that are going to be very good at doing those kind of like schema documentation, event documentation, that sort of stuff, right? And so let's integrate with them. That's not to say that like longer term we might have like schema registry type product and so on, like EventBridge, but right now we kind of like differ to integrations with other tools.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I guess so. I've actually spoke with David on this podcast. So by the time you listen to this, that episode is probably out already, where
Oh,
he
so yeah,
showed
that's
us a little bit
timely.
more about the event catalog.
Yeah, it's
And
awesome
yeah,
what
he's
he's
doing some
building.
really interesting stuff in that space as well. Again, really very common problem people run into, and so yeah, interested to hear that your thoughts about that in terms of integrating as opposed to trying to implement this feature yourself. Okay, so I think that's quite a nice overview of Hookdeck. Let's talk a little bit more about how it's implemented under the hood, because you talked about the
Yeah,
fact
that's
that
awesome.
it's a queue, and you mentioned previously that you're running on Cloudflare workers for ingestion, and then the Google pops up. Is that right?
Yeah, partially. There's actually
Okay.
like a mix of Kafka plus Redis, like you name
Okay.
it.
Okay. All right.
We're kind of using the right tool for the job, and depending on the different like context. But yeah, like for the gist of it, like our architecture is really segmenting into two components that are completely independent from each other. So we have the ingestion, which is think of it as kind of like the API layer. And that API layer is where all the events are produced and consumed, right? And then the second part is what we call our event lifecycle, or really it's like the delivery queue. And so those are like the subsystems that are going to determine like which event need to go where, execute transformation, do delivery, handle the retries, the retry logic, the operations for bulk retrying, that sort of stuff, right? And so that first part is kind of like fully serverless. That second part is partially serverless. It's mostly Kubernetes type clusters that are working on the actual operation side of things. But then we do use PubSub, Kafka, Redis as kind of like queuing for various different situations. So yeah, those are kind of like two distinct part that are both using serverless in their own way.
Okay, so in this case, you've got your Cloudflare workers running on the edge doing the ingestion, and then they get sent into Google Cloud into something. And again, I guess when on the way out to the target, you are using a combination of a PubSub and a few other things to handle well the various different constraints like the concurrency control, retries, and things like that. Actually, I forgot to ask as well in terms of like for example, one of the common things that you see with event-driven architecture is that it's not just about one event coming in and then goes to a target, but certainly that's more. So I guess I think you called it the classic event-driven architecture is the fact that the event consumers quickly turn into publishers, and then you have this chain of events happening. How
Yeah.
can Hookdeck kind of help us visualize that? Because you've got, typically that's again something that you kind of do on your side with, with observability tooling. You instrumentation, you instrument your code and use other tools to kind of visualize that. But is there something in the in Hookdeck that can potentially help in terms of discovering who your subscribers are and what your topology looks like when it comes to your event architecture?
Yeah, and I totally getting back into that topic. Like, I think what's nice about the idea of being able to declare kind of your producers and your consumers is that it also lets you kind of map it out. Because in the AWS context, your consumers are self-declared, right? So as a consumer, you want to listen like to a specific queue or like react to a specific event. But there's a decoupling because of the consumer declaring it. While in Hookdeck, it's the other way around, where you declare where your consumers are, who they are, what endpoint they are, right? And so when you look at this kind of like dashboard in Hookdeck and you look at those graphs that are kind of made out for you, right? Like those kind of node network that we were just looking at earlier, it makes it super clear what's what, right? And then we also have this concept of callback. And so coming back to consumers turning into publishers and so on, the concept of callback is basically this idea that in response to an event can generate a new event, right? And then also go through its own life cycle. And so if your consumer returns specific data, you can then say, okay, for that specific data, I want that to now become a new event, and that new event can now go to a new destination, a new consumer, and so on, right? And so you have this like relationship where if you have like, for instance, like an event that like essentially turns into an action, that action can now be the result of the original kind of like integration event or whatever that got to your endpoint. And so that's how we're thinking about it. I think there's a lot more that we can do on that front. Like it's still early in the sense of like how native the support for that sort of stuff is. But there's already a ton of people using it and making the best of it.
Okay, that's very interesting. That's very interesting. I guess that's I think that's all the questions I can think of. Anything else that we haven't talked about that you'd like to mention before we go?
Well, I think like specifically when it comes to, we talked a lot about the AWS environment and all that. one thing that I kind of mentioned earlier is that we're building direct integrations with a lot of those services in such a way that you don't necessarily have to go through HTTP, right?
Right.
And so, if as part of the audience, that's something that you're working on, or there's like compatibility that you'd like to see, and so on, we're kind of like talking with a lot of users in those environments to understand like what the needs are, what the different like integration points that we can do that are the most useful. And so I definitely love to hear you on that. And if you have any thoughts on where you would see Hookdeck kind of fit in. But yeah, no, I mean, that covers it. Like, always happy to get nerdy about the whole Cloudflare and GCP stuff and all that. But I'm going to leave that up to you.
Actually, that brings a good point about the integration with, say, for example, Lambda right now using function URL. What's the security model? I guess do I have to leave my function URL public for you to call it, or can I, say use IAM roles for that?
Yeah, you can use IAM role through service
Okay.
accounts, and so you provide a deck like basically with a service account to use, right? That you can then grant like the permissions to the individual functions or buckets or like whatever resources in the AWS environment.
Okay, so do I? So are you saying that I create an IAM role and then I let you assume that role? So does that mean that I need to know your how are you going to assume that role? Are you going to assume that role from your own AWS account or
It's through
from
access
some
tokens.
access token? Okay.
And so, yeah, you would generate like access token that we can assume that rolled through. Yeah.
Okay, right, I see. Okay, all right, thank you very much. Yeah, so I guess if anyone's got any questions, where do they go? If they want to get started, do they just go to hookdeck.com and then just try out for themselves?
Yeah, I mean, it's self-serve. We have a generous free plan. You can build a lot with it, and you can also like reach out to me directly, either Alex Bouchard on Twitter, Blue Sky now since yesterday, or really reach out on our Slack developer community, and we'll be happy to jump in and have that conversation with you.
Okay, sounds good. And your pricing is based on usage levels, number of events that you're sending, and okay, all right, gotcha.
Yeah, very much kind of like usage-based pricing that you would expect from most like cloud infrastructure products.
Okay, sounds good. All right, and yeah, I'll put those links in the description below so that anyone who's interested in checking out Hookdeck, they can go and try out for themselves. And yeah, thank you so much, Alex, for coming on the show and showing us, what we've been building. And I have to say, some of the things that people, some things that I'm most impressed by from what I've seen are things that are the small cuts that gets you on an everyday basis. Things like how to handle errors, how to replay failed events, and how to test your transformation logic. But I think probably the one that's probably the most interesting, probably from the development point of view, is just the local development, being able to easily replay an event against my local environment. But again, for me, I'm always responsible for running the thing that I'm building as opposed to just writing the code. So for me, the kind of dealing with errors and delta queue side of things, that for me was the highlight. It's yeah, super interesting there.
Listen, like I have hard to I've yet to meet someone that is not getting their gear grinded by all of that. So I totally get it. I appreciate the chance to come on and share more about it, and thanks for jumping in and challenging some of the ideas and all that sort of stuff. I think that's how we're gonna make a better product. So I appreciate it.
No worries, no worries. Nice talking to you and everyone else. I guess I'll see you guys next time. Take care now. Okay, bye bye.
Sweet. Take care. Yeah.